Hello and welcome back to this emotional health webinar series brought to you by the SATB2 Gene Foundation. I'm joined again by Shepard, a licensed professional counselor that specializes in helping families on difficult parenting journeys. Today, she's talking to us on the topic of walking through grief while parenting kids with disabilities.
Hey everyone, so today we are back and we are going to be talking about walking through grief while we're parenting kids who have disabilities. This is a topic that I am incredibly passionate about because it is often overlooked and it kind of catches us by surprise. You know, for me personally, when my daughter came to me, she came to me as a foster kiddo, and when they called, they were like, you know, she's on meds because she had seizures, but don't worry, she doesn't have epilepsy. It's not a big deal. And we kept going through these different like spurts, and they'd be like, no, she's just having seizures because she's stressed. It's not a big deal. And then all of a sudden we got in this space where the whole world turned upside down and things got really, really hard, and they stayed hard for a really long time. And all of a sudden we're facing things like this is going to be forever, and this is going to be hard, and we don't know what the next step is. And I was kind of in that space of just holding everything together and just trying to survive. And then we got this genetic diagnosis, and there's kind of, for me, like this split where there's like before diagnosis and there's after diagnosis, and they're very different worlds. Okay? But when I got that diagnosis, everything just crashed. The whole world went dark for me. And I struggled probably harder than I have in my entire life. And I did for a while. And I was in grad school at the time. I'm learning how to be a counselor. And also I'm completely struggling. And I thought that something was totally wrong with me. I looked around at the parents that I knew, which wasn't very many, that had kids with disabilities. And I was like, they're doing so great. They are these fabulous advocates. They are so strong. They're all these, you know, all those cliches that people say. And I thought the fact that I was struggling meant that something was really wrong with me. I didn't understand it. And so I really suffered very deeply in a lot of isolation for a while. And I was at Walmart one day, and I happened to pick up this book called Bloom by Kelly Hampton out of the bargain bin. And in it, she talked about her experience of having a daughter who's unexpectedly born with Down syndrome and her grief journey. And it was like this, you know, the light came on and it was like, oh, it's not just me. And then I started digging deeper and I started really working on this for myself, and then later kind of specializing in it with my clients. And what I learned is that the vast majority of parents who have kids with disabilities walk through grief when it comes to the disability and the diagnosis. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But we want to recognize that this is a common experience in our world. This doesn't have anything to do with how much you love your child. In fact, most of the time it's linked to it. That of course you're going to struggle because you love this little person, and we're brokenhearted that they're facing this, and that our family is facing this, and that everything just shifted. Okay. And so, but when we think about it, you know, most people know about the stages of grief. And there's this idea that we kind of go through this cycle after we lose somebody. I like to think of it more like the terrains of grief, because these are different. It's like we're on this really long journey, like this Frodo style journey. And in this journey, we walk through very different terrains, and occasionally an orc jumps out and tries to eat us. Right? And so we're going to see the way these different terrains show up. But we're also going to recognize that they look very different for lots of different people, that if you're in a relationship, they probably look different for both of you, and you probably go through different terrains at the same time. And that most people end up cycling through them multiple times. And we kind of bounce from one to another a lot. So as we do this, what I'd like you to do is really think about identifying the stage that you're in, and focusing on what that grief is telling you, and then using specific skills for that stage to manage it. When I say what that grief is telling you, that's a really important part, because the truth is that each of these stages exists for a reason. These are not just, oh, I'm having trouble coping with it. Every single one of those is there on purpose. This is a beautiful design. It's a horrible thing to experience in many times, but it's actually exactly what we need for this journey. And we're going to talk about, for each of the terrains, we're going to talk about what the purpose is there. So for most people, we're going to start in this space we call denial. Now, denial, again, it's super important. This is not just a refusal to admit the truth. This is that our brains are physically not able to accept how much the world has just changed. Right? Everything is shifted. We don't know what's real. We don't know what's normal anymore. And so our brains are like, I can't take that in. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit the way I understand the entire planet, all of my life. And so our brains really struggle to take it in. And that's typical, and that's normal, and that's important, because if you were to swallow it whole in that very first minute, you would be completely knocked off center, right? For a lot of people, this shows up in maybe having some difficulty in believing the diagnosis, not being sure, maybe we want more and more second opinions, that kind of thing. Or for a lot of people, it can also feel like just being frozen. Like, I can't even move. I can't function. I just don't even know what to do with this. And the biggest challenge of it is that it can make it hard to act. Right? Now, one of the ways that I kind of think about this is that denial is kind of like driving in the mountains. So, I'm in Texas, where everything's like flat and you can just see forever, and it's not a big deal. But when I go to Colorado, I love Colorado, but when I go to Colorado, you drive on these terrifying roads that are way up in the mountains, and these roads are like this thin. And on one side you have like a giant mountain, and on the other side you have a cliff. And if you go off the road 3 inches, you're going to fall 100 feet to your death, right? And so in that space, it's so scary to look, off to the side. But so there's this tendency, oh, you know what? It's so beautiful. I'm just going to look at the view. I'm just going to ignore all of the danger. I'm just going to look at the view. And also, it's a really precarious spot to be, because there's so much fear. I've got to stay just looking at that view, because if I don't, I'm going to fall off the edge, or I'm going to see all this stuff that's really scary. It's kind of where denial is. It's our brains trying to figure out, like, what's the piece that I can take in? What's the spot where I can focus? Because if I take all this in, it's going to be too much. It's a protective thing. Okay. So in this space, what we want to really focus on is accepting the spots, accepting the things that we have to accept, and giving ourselves permission to wait on everything else. So you might have to say, we're going to make a decision about a medication today. You might have to decide, if you've got a little one, I'm going to, even if I can't accept the whole diagnosis, we might say, I'm going to really work on letting myself bring in ECI so we can get the services we need while they're still little, and we can make a bigger difference. We're going to look at those things that are time sensitive and focus on just accepting those parts. You've got all the time in the world to accept the rest. There is not a rush. There is not pressure. We're only going to look at what are the things that really matter in this moment that I take in and that I change behavior on. Okay. And we're going to focus on some really gentle self-care. Our bodies in this space are typically completely overwhelmed. And so we're going to do things that help us center. Maybe that's doing some gentle, long baths or gentle walks, or we're not going to be doing things that are really hard, because most of the time your body feels really depleted. And so we're just going to focus on nourishment in that space. For a lot of people, as we get out of denial, we move into this space that is anger. And anger is important. All of these are so important because anger helps us fight for our kiddos. It helps us get that fire inside of us. But when I think about anger, I think about it like it's a volcano. And sometimes you have those volcanoes that, spurt out a little bit of lava at a time, and they create more islands, and it kind of builds. And then sometimes you have those volcanoes that all of a sudden one day the entire top blows off and it's destructive and deadly. And so as we're feeling that anger, what we really want to do is we want to look at ways where we channel it so that it's constructive, not destructive, right? So that it doesn't burn us up from the inside. We're not wanting to just hold all of it in, but we also want to do things where we're not completely blowing things up. So a lot of times when we're in that anger spot, it might look like blaming yourself, blaming other people. It might look like some really big outburst. It might look like really fighting the prognosis. And again, sometimes that's a good thing. There's a lot of kiddos who maybe they've been misdiagnosed, or they've been denied treatments, or they've had times when they didn't get what they needed and they had a parent who just stood up and went to bat for them, and that made the difference for that kiddo. So those are great things. Our challenge is, if we're fighting the school for services and we're in an angry spot, we want to be able to channel it into, maybe it's the letter to the principal saying either you're going to do what's right or I'm calling a lawyer, versus showing up and screaming at the principal so you get kicked out of the campus, right? Which is not going to serve your child well, right? We're looking at those things where how do we channel it in a way that serves us and our kiddos and our families well. And sometimes when it gets big, it gets in the way of that. Or it can cause big damage to relationships, right? And so some of the things that we're doing in this space is we're really looking at giving the anger a healthy outlet. One of the things that really helps for a lot of people is if you're angry at the doctor, if you're angry at the principal, whatever that is, writing letters that you don't send, and then we come back and we write the email that we're actually going to send, or then we have the conversation. But we have that first chance, and it can be vulgar, it can be full of cuss words, it can be angry and vile and rah. And then we come back and we've gotten a chance to give that anger a space to go, and we come back and we're going to have that logical conversation that our kids need us to have. Right? We're also going to look at focusing on some big aerobic exercises and big body movements. So when we think about fight, flight, freeze responses, anger is the fight. Anger, it physically makes all the blood go to your extremities, and so you're getting ready. You've got more blood in the muscles in your arms so that you can hit, so that you can swing, so that you can survive a physical threat, because that's how your body is wired to react. So we're going to do things that lets our body use up all of that adrenaline, use up all of that response there, because otherwise what happens is it just kind of circulates, and it can feel like you've had 17 shots of espresso and you're just like, right? Because it's physically in our bodies. We need a space for that to go. We want to find ways that, especially if you can channel that anger into something physical related to the challenge. And so for some people, it might be, I'm going to go do a 5K to, raise money for a cure. When my daughter was early on in her journey, I did MMA, and so we would do these quick drills on the bags, and when I would punch, I would use her diagnosis as my mantra there, and so I would do PCDH19 over and over and over, and I have this image in my head of physically punching the monster that's attacking my family. Right, so we're looking for things like that, where we're giving all of that energy, all of that anger, a physical space to go, okay? Which again, that's very different from those things that we're using when we're in denial, because our bodies are in different spaces. And so we just need the things that make sense there. Okay. A lot of times the next space we go is bargaining. And so bargaining I like to think about it, it's like you're walking in the desert. Like there's this place called the Great Sand Dunes. It's a national park. And so there's just miles and miles and miles of these huge sand dunes. And if you try to go across them, it's hot, you're getting weighed down, and you're just trudging. And it just always feels like the edge is just right out of your distance, right? I'm just almost there, but I never quite get to the end. And a lot of times that's what bargaining feels like. I have this idea, if I can just do this one thing, if I can just do this other thing, everything's going to be okay. And a lot of times this is helpful because sometimes we actually do figure out things that are going to be helpful, right? And so we might spend so much time researching that we actually find a treatment that helps our kiddo. We might go out there and do enough advocacy that we are able to raise money and we get closer to a cure, or we get research done that's needed. Actual real life positive stuff comes out of it. Our challenge is that a lot of times it doesn't actually change what our child is dealing with, and it doesn't change our long-term challenges. And that can be very, very discouraging. And it always feels like we're just one step away. If we just do a little bit more, a little bit more. So sometimes this can have religious elements for people. This is a space where a lot of parents get really involved in advocacy. But we have this narrative, if I just X, then this is what happens. This is where they'll do this. It can turn into self-blame. So, well, we're still struggling because I haven't done enough, or I'm not enough, or if I would have just done this, it wouldn't be here. And it can also cause a lot of strife if there's disagreements in how many resources we have. Especially if we've got two parents that are not in the same space or not responding to it in the same way. If you've got one parent who's like, I'm going to go and I'm going to do this and this and this and this, and the other parent's like, well, no, I think we ought to do this, or we actually only have the family resources to do this, that can cause a lot of strife because there's so much pressure there that it feels like if I don't do this, everything's going to collapse and my partner's not supporting me, or my partner doesn't love my kid enough to do this. And even though as a kind of a rational space, we can step back and be like, well, that's probably not truth. But it feels really big in that moment. And so what we kind of want to think about in these spaces are looking at activities or treatments that are realistic for your family. It doesn't matter what works for anybody else. This is about what matters for you, for your child, for your family. Where are you at? What are the realistic resources that you've got? What can you do, right? This is a space where for a lot of parents, getting involved in community is really helpful. It's helpful in a feeling less isolated way. And there is a sense of power in being able to advocate, being able to help other parents that are on the same journey. And as we do that, a lot of times it brings us a sense of peace because we're not just sitting helplessly by while this disease or this diagnosis takes over our child or our family. We also want to really pay attention in this space to what our kiddo actually needs and wants. So they might have an opinion on how much therapy or what therapy goals should be or what treatment outcomes should be. Or sometimes we get so hyper focused on helping our kids get to better, whatever better looks like for you, that we lose sight of the really wonderful things that our kiddos have that they bring to the table and how great of human beings that they are, because we're so focused on that. And so we really want to step back and purposely notice, hey, here's the things that make my child light up. Here are the wonderful, awesome things about them. And we're just looking for some balance right there. All we're doing is we're looking for, I'm going to help them get to a better space and I'm going to accept who they are. And that is so much easier said than done. That is a hard, tricky balance to find, and it takes a while. And so if it takes some time, that's okay. But that's kind of where we're aiming. And then most parents get into this space that we call depression. And so sometimes that's a clinical depression, and sometimes that's just this terrain of depression where everything's darker and it's sadder and it's just heavy and it's a struggle. And that is an important spot because every emotion has a reason. Every emotion tells me something. Sadness tells me that there's been a loss, and there has. There's been a loss of the dreams that I had for my family and for my kiddo. There's been a loss of health. There's been a loss of the way the future should have looked. And it is good and it is normal and it is human to grieve that loss, to feel sad right there. So for a lot of parents, this is a space where that sadness just kind of takes over. You might find yourself feeling weepy. You might find yourself not having much motivation, pulling back in yourself and getting more isolated. For moms especially, one of the things that's a bigger risk is this thing we call functional depression. So when you're looking at TV and you see people being depressed, you might think depression is they lock themselves in their dark bedroom and they don't ever come out and they do all these things by themselves and they don't go to work and they don't feed their kids and all of this. And the reality is that for most moms, that level of depression isn't an option. You have to get up. You have to go to the doctor. You have to feed the kids. You have to go and do X, Y, Z. And so when functional depression goes, everything is dark, everything is cloudy, and you're probably only doing the things that absolutely have to get done. And you're going to notice those things that change for you. And so, maybe you're one of those parents that wants to make sure your kiddos eat healthy every day. And you get in this functional depression space and you're still feeding your kids. Like, this is not neglect, you're still feeding them, but maybe they're eating fast food more often than you're healthy and than you would feed them when you're healthy. Maybe your house gets messier than you are okay with it being. Maybe everything is dark, or the things that, like, maybe taking care of yourself becomes a lot harder. I had to have surgery on my thyroid when my daughter got sick, when she first got sick. And I put it off until it was at the space where I could barely breathe because it had gotten so big and inflamed, because it was like, well, I have to push me off. I've got to keep her alive. I've got to focus on this. And then it waits until it becomes a crisis before we take care of ourselves. And that kind of thing is really common in this space because we're so focused on just doing what absolutely has to be done. And then we can't take care of ourselves because there's just not energy for it. And it feels like you're drained and you're sapped. And so our challenges are that this can absolutely lead into clinical depression, where we might need to talk to a doctor or to a therapist. And a lot of times those daily tasks get to where they just feel completely overwhelming. So this is a space where, as much as we can, we want to lean on our community. We want to reach out. We want to talk to the other parents that are going through this journey. We want to find our people, and we want to give ourselves permission to just grieve that and allow that sadness to speak. It's so important. That sadness is there for a reason, and what it has to say matters. And so we're going to listen. If we get stuck, so especially if you get in that space where it's getting hard to function and you stay there for more than about 2 weeks, that's a time when we want to talk to our doctor or to a therapist. Not because you're crazy, not because this isn't something that we can walk out of, but because this is really hard and sometimes we need help in this space in the journey. It's just heavy, right? And we need somebody to walk alongside us and help us carry it. Right. And then we have this terrain that we call acceptance. And acceptance does not look like typical parenting. This is not everything is better, everything is fantastic. This is, I've come to a space where I'm at peace. I can manage the difficulties right now. I can make meaning with what we're facing, and I can feel like I'm okay on this journey. When I think about this, I think about Joshua Tree National Park. It's my favorite of the national parks. We've been to about a third of them now, but it's my very favorite, and it is this very harsh, rugged desert that is absolutely gorgeous. When I think about acceptance here, that's what I think about. But it's not the botanical gardens. It's not this beautiful, lush space of typical parenting. Things are still hard. Like, you're so different than I expected. And also there's beauty here. And so this is that spot where we're finding our normal. We feel more competent. We've got our feet underneath us and we're able to manage. Some of the challenges that come up here can kind of happen from either outside or within. And from the outside, it's often people not accepting that you're okay, or it's people assuming that because you're okay, you don't still have struggles. And so you might find that you lose some support here because people don't see you as being in crisis. Or you might find that people are like, no, I would never be okay if I was facing that. So obviously they're in denial. That's not real. They're probably, you know, life is miserable for them. And they're gonna, you may feel that, that bump up against that from other people. From within, sometimes acceptance can be a scary place because it feels, we remember how dark it got. We remember how hard it was. And it can be scary to think of, what if I don't stay here? What if things get hard again? We're in a spot where we can manage it, but you might look at how your prognosis goes over time and say, oh, when we hit this thing, it's going to get really hard again. And that's really scary. Or what happens when we struggle again? And so what we really want to do in these spaces is start practicing gratitude. We're going to look at being able to say, you know what, in this moment, I'm okay. I'm going to be grateful that my kiddo did X, Y, Z. Even if it doesn't look like what other people might be grateful for, I'm allowed to be grateful for it. You know, I remember the very first time I saw my daughter play. She was 9 years old, and we were at a Christmas Eve candlelight service. And the year before, we had gone to the candlelight service and she caught her hair on fire. And I cussed in the middle of a candlelight Christmas Eve service. So this year, we brought fake candles because we didn't want that to repeat. And so we're sitting in this service, and I look over and she's taken this candle and she was using it like an airplane. And I'd never seen her do anything imaginative before. And I swear to you, it felt like a miracle. It was this huge, amazing thing. And so I went to my friends. When we get done with Christmas break, I go back to work and I see my friends, and I said, I need you to be super excited with me, because when that happens, all of a sudden we have this whole new world of play, and we had naked Barbies in our house for the first time ever. And I'm like, I need you to be super excited with me because we have naked Barbies in our house, and this is big and this is exciting, right? I need you to join me in rejoicing here. And that's not something that any parent of a typical 9-year-old is going to be like, yay! For me, it was huge, right? And we're going to let ourselves practice that gratitude and just embrace those milestones when we hit them. Just go to that spot where we're so happy and excited. And we're going to spend some of the time in this space purposefully creating systems that work for our families and for our unique needs. And this is easier to do in this space because we've been able to really accept what some of those limitations are. We've been able to figure out what are the things that we can't handle and what are the things that we can. And so we're going to create systems that match that. And that's going to help us if we do struggle down the road, because we're going to go in there knowing, hey, you know what? We've managed this before. This is still hard. This is still brutal, but we've done this before and we're set up for this now. So when we think about this grief journey, one of the most important things we want to recognize is that this is not a straight line. This is not you go through the stages, you click the boxes, boom, 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 and then we're in acceptance and we stay there and life is great. That's not how this is going to look. For most people, we're going to go back through the different kinds of terrain, right? We hit the desert, and then we go through the forest, and then there's more desert after that. And there's mountains along the way, and there's hard things that come up, and the different things that put us back into different spaces. And that's just part of this journey. That's not something that if we don't race to acceptance and stay there, then we're failing. It's just that this journey has lots of different kinds of terrain, and most people are going to go through most of them. So we're going to also recognize everybody is going to react to different triggers in different ways. So there's going to be things that might put you into a space of depression that somebody else goes straight to bargaining or denial or anger. And all of that's all right. We all respond because all of us had different dreams about parenting. All of us had different ideas on goals and hopes. And so each of us is going to have a different experience in it. Okay? But wherever you are is just where you're at. Our goal is to just figure out, how do we cope with the space that we're in today? How do I make meaning from this space where I'm at? How do I manage it? Our goal is not to just get to the end. As we're coping with each of those different stages, we want to really give ourselves permission to be where we're at. And we want to focus on coping in the ways that match the stage where we're in and that match who we are. And we're going to notice that those change over time. The things that made sense for you when you were in one stage may not make sense in another, and that's okay. We're going to do the things that matter for us in that moment. We also want to really look at ways that we make meaning of our situation. But when we think about making meaning, this is not coming to the space where we're like, all of this is fabulous and I wouldn't change anything and it's all great and it's perfect, because that's probably not truth, right? Meaning is more that I can manage this, or here's the ways that I've grown in it. Here's the beautiful parts of it. And also here's the very real struggles of it. Here's the things that I'm doing to help me make peace. Now we can explore things like, here's the benefits to my kiddos' differences. Here's the way that neurodiversity or physical diversity make the world a fantastic, much wonderful place, without having to say like everything is rosy and like the little Lego song, everything is awesome, because it doesn't really resonate and it doesn't feel like truth. We're also going to think about some of the short-term and the long-term stuff. So it can be really easy to get bogged down either in forever is going to be so hard, or this current crisis is all that I can see. And sometimes as we kind of get some balance, if we're in the middle of a crisis, being able to look forward and see there's going to be some better days. There's going to be times when we can manage this well and we're going to find happiness again. Then it helps us balance the really hard part of the moment. If we're looking and we're saying we've got this prognosis that means at this age things are going to really decline, or I'm looking at the future and I don't know how we're going to manage this aspect, then sometimes being able to stop and slow down and say, you know what, in this moment, we're going to sit and cuddle on the couch and watch Rapunzel for the 87,000th time, and we're going to enjoy that. Then there's that shift that kind of helps us get balanced there too. We also really want to look at finding ourselves on this journey. So we want to think about the ways that we find our own voices, and where do we like to use it? What does it sound like? And how does your particular strength and personality as a parent show up in a wonderful way? Like you have things inside you that benefit your child specifically, and maybe even children on this journey in general. But there's pieces of you that are exactly what your kiddo needs. And being able to recognize that really helps us manage this. So when my oldest was diagnosed with autism, at first, it wasn't the same experience of a diagnosis, but it really did hit. It just, it's a really hard thing. And I sat with it for a while, and then I kind of came to this realization that there's some ways that I'm a really good autism mom. Like, if you want to geek out and hyper focus on something and get totally fixated on something, I will love doing that with you. When we got interested in trains when he was younger, we drove all over the state and looked at train yards, and it was fun and it was fantastic. And that just kind of came naturally for me. And so being able to realize, hey, you know what, there's these pieces that I actually do really well here, even before I knew it was a thing, is something that that's really important in this journey, finding those things where you have strengths and they matter for your kiddo. We want to recognize that. We also want to make sure we have people that we connect with that maybe aren't in our little world, in our little bubble, so that we kind of have that balance. And we want to look at, what kind of parent did I want to be before this happened? And what are the parts of that that are still possible? And then we're always going to be remembering to really focus on that self-care and nourishing our souls. We're going to look at the other people on our path. And so sometimes that means really working on finding your tribe. A lot of times it also means budgeting our energy and setting boundaries with those people around us. Like, hey, you know what, while we're in this particular place in this, maybe I can't go hang out like I used to. Maybe I can't have as many things as I want to. Here's the ways that I can connect. And then we really want to focus on something that's so hard, but that's parenting your child in the unique way that they need you to, not like everybody else thinks you should. So our kids need things that are different. They need things that don't look typical. And sometimes being the absolute best parent for their child in front of you does not look like the traditional Mom of the Year award kind of parenting. And we're going to give ourselves permission for that, to show up in the best way we can for the kiddo that we have in front of us and take care of ourselves in the way. So I always wanted to mention, there are times that in this journey we need extra support. And that makes sense because this is a really hard journey. So if you're in a space where you have any thoughts of hurting yourself, hurting anybody else, that's a time to talk to your doctor or to a therapist. If you get feeling like you're really stuck, like I'm in this particular terrain and I can't move through it, it's getting really hard to handle daily tasks, the depression just won't lift, things are getting dark, or if you feel like you're losing yourself or your ability to show up in a way you're proud of, or you're feeling like you're struggling to connect with people. In the last one we talked about some of the different ways that sometimes self-care starts to, instead of being healthy, it starts to just shut down all of our emotions. If we're doing those kinds of things, then that's a space where we really need to talk to somebody and get some extra support, right? But we also just want to remember that almost every parent is going to walk through these stages, these terrains. We're going to do it in different ways at different times with different triggers. But this is a hard journey, and the fact that you're struggling on it makes sense. It doesn't mean that you're a bad parent or there's anything wrong with you. It just means that this is hard. And we're going to be able to get through it though. We can figure this out.